I grew up in Medicine Bow, Wyoming. Over time, I pieced together fragments of Robert's history. He'd volunteered for Vietnam, but after returning home, he couldn't readjust to civilian life. He relocated his trailer near East Allen Lake, and locals warned children never to approach the north side after dark. Robert hunted squirrels there for food, and you wouldn't want him mistaking you for game. The older residents delivered this warning with deadly seriousness, but something didn't quite add up about how people talked about him. Everyone acted terrified, yet some seemed to pity him. When I was 14, hanging out with my friend Derek, his mother drove us somewhere. Derek brought up Robert Barnes like he was the bogeyman incarnate, but his mom simply sighed and said, "That poor man just wants to be left alone." Derek protested, "Mum, he killed someone." A strange transformation came over her face, like she was donning a mask as she warned him sternly to stay away from that trailer. It felt like we'd caught her in some contradiction I wouldn't understand for years. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Alright, let's dive back in. By 17, I'd convinced myself Robert Barnes was pure evil. One Friday night, after a few wine coolers while watching her shows, Mum got emotional looking through old photographs. She showed me pictures of herself and her high school friends, including the boy Robert allegedly murdered. With tears streaming down her face, she finally told me the full story. Her friend had been drinking by the lake with buddies when he wandered off to relieve himself. That's when he spotted someone carrying what appeared to be a small child over their shoulder. He shouted at the figure, who took off running with the child, so he and his friends gave chase. When they caught up, with Mum's friend in the lead, the man dropped the child, spun around, and opened fire. Bang, 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 bang. Mum's friend died before hitting the ground. Though they rescued the child and rushed her to the hospital, she died anyway from a massive dose of tranquilizers that had damaged her organs. All the teenagers at the lake that night identified Robert Barnes as the shooter, yet somehow he was never arrested or jailed. Finally, I understood the fear and hatred, or so I thought. Months passed with this rage festering inside me. I told my friends about it, so they knew why I despised Robert Barnes for burdening my mother with lifelong trauma. One night around our campfire, I suggested we do something about it. One friend had asked his father about the little girl who'd died. His dad confirmed it was true, though people avoided discussing it since you never knew when the girl's mother might overhear in a store. The one detail that differed, the child had appeared in town, not been found near the lake. That discrepancy didn't matter to me. The story was essentially the same, and Robert Barnes needed to pay for his decades-old crime. I hatched my plan that very night. I would hike to his trailer in darkness, watch to ensure no one was awake, then set it ablaze. Yes, incredibly stupid I could have killed him, but in my teenage mind, he'd wake up, escape outside, stand there angry, then have to relocate. I was young and foolish, so things didn't unfold that way at all. It took weeks before I worked up the courage to acquire the necessary supplies. Having no money, I stole paint thinner from our school's art room. Then one Friday, after hanging with friends at our usual campfire, I lied about heading home and instead walked toward Robert's place. The hour-long trek around the lake in darkness seemed endless. About half a mile out, I switched off my flashlight and followed the water's edge until I spotted a dim light from Robert's trailer. Following my plan, I watched the place for 40 to 45 minutes until the television sounds ceased and the light went dark. I waited another couple minutes until everything was completely silent and still. Then I crept forward with my paint thinner. My heart hammered as I approached within a few feet. The trailer remained silent, making me confident I'd gone undetected. But just as I reached for the paint thinner lid, I heard a loud click to my right and unmistakably, a gun being cocked followed by a voice. "What you got there, boy?" I froze solid, knowing Robert had caught me red-handed attempting arson. I didn't want to reveal what I was holding, certain that once he understood my intentions, he'd shoot me without hesitation. So I stayed silent. Robert ordered me to drop what I was carrying. When the can hit the ground, I saw a flashlight beam sweep over it. As he realized what I'd planned, he commanded me to turn around. He wanted to see my face before killing me, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there, trembling. Robert rushed forward and spun me around forcefully. When he saw my face, though, he shoved me backwards so I fell, then just stared at me while lowering his weapon. I was so terrified that even though I desperately wanted to beg for my life, no words would come. Then, shockingly, he said my name aloud to confirm my identity. My terror now mixed with utter confusion. He knew my name. He knew who my mother was, too. After I confirmed who I was, he said something that made my blood run cold. "I wondered how long it'd be before you showed up." What did that mean? My first words finally emerged. "How'd you know me?" Robert invited me inside his trailer and promised to answer all my questions. Once we sat down, he asked what my mother had told me about him. Having regained some courage, I explained how I hated him for murdering Mum's friend. He asked me to describe exactly how I thought events had unfolded, and he smiled throughout my recitation without interrupting once. When I finished, Robert said, "Okay, kid, here's what really happened. The truth was nothing like I'd been told. Mum's friend had been deeply troubled growing up. Despite people's attempts to help, he only worsened into his teenage years. He was expelled for stealing girls' underwear from the locker room. Police caught him exposing himself to middle schoolers, though he received lesser charges by claiming he was just urinating. In the months before his death, parents had confronted him for talking to their children. He insisted he was merely playing with them. The night he died, it wasn't Robert walking near the lake with a child over his shoulder. It was Mum's friend. The actual events had unfolded in almost complete reverse. Robert had been hunting squirrels, as was his habit, when he came across intoxicated teenagers walking by the lake at night. Under the full moon, he could see them clearly moving through the brush. He followed to ensure they weren't headed toward his trailer. While tracking them along the lake's edge, listening to their laughter and shouting, Robert realized one of them was carrying something over his shoulder, something that looked disturbingly like a child with long, glossy hair shining in the moonlight. Robert moved closer and heard the unthinkable. The group was planning to do something terrible to what he now recognized was an unconscious child. The moment he understood this, Robert flicked on his flashlight and ordered them to drop the child. The guy carrying her mom's high school friend pulled out a knife instead. He was halfway to plunging it into the child's chest when Robert fired several 22 rounds through his chest, dropping him dead instantly. Robert didn't get a clear look at the kids who fled, though at least one was definitely female. He picked up the unconscious child, carried her all the way into town, and left her at the gas station with the night clerk. The clerk called 911, but Robert didn't wait around. He simply told the clerk there was a body by the lake and that police should visit Robert Barnes's place because he was responsible. Police arrived the next morning and took Robert into custody, but his story checked out completely. The missing girl's parents were too relieved to have her back to do anything but thank him profusely. To them, Robert was a hero. To himself, he felt anything but. After returning from Vietnam, Robert had vowed never to hurt another human being as long as he lived. That was half the reason he'd isolated himself in the wilderness. If he'd managed to save that girl's life, perhaps it would have justified everything. But she was likely already dying from the tranquilizers by the time he first spotted her. So killing Mom's friend had merely helped a sick individual escape justice for his crimes. What made Robert physically ill, what made it feel like double the waste, was that the others had escaped. That he avoided town, he could understand being around the grown-up versions of those little monsters who'd gotten away with ending that girl's life. He didn't know exactly who they were, but he suspected there was a strong chance my mother was one of them. Robert's final words hit like a sledgehammer. He said he didn't care whether I believed him or not. He just wanted me to do one favor. Go home, tell my mother what he'd just told me, then look her dead in the eye and ask if it was all true or not. I did exactly that. Without describing the blow-by-blow details of how that confrontation unfolded, let's just say our relationship never recovered. She's the reason I haven't returned to Wyoming in almost 20 years. Back in 2002, my boyfriend Marcus and I were driving from Chicago to his parents' home in Vermilion, South Dakota. Around noon, after hours of cruising through endless Iowa cornfields, the corn suddenly stopped. It was like emerging from a forest into a clearing, except instead of green grass, we saw only ash and charcoal. There had obviously been a massive fire. Marcus mentioned that farmers sometimes burn fields to prepare them for new planting cycles, but this looked unsettling as hell. Our visibility went from just a few feet on either side of the highway to miles upon miles in every direction. That's when I spotted them. In the distance, a man and small boy walked hand in hand through the burned-out field. Even from far away, the scene looked wholesome, like a grandfather showing his grandson the charred landscape. As I watched them from a distance, I saw they were heading toward what appeared to be an old well. I didn't mention it to Marcus. We were enjoying a comfortable silence with some music playing, so I just watched this Hallmark card scene draw closer as we drove. By the time they reached the well, I could see both figures in near-perfect detail. The older man wore denim overalls and had thinning dark hair. The little boy had a blue shirt, white sneakers, and almost platinum blonde curly hair. Then, as we drove directly past them, I saw it clear as Datha. Old man picked up the little boy and threw him down the well. I screamed, "Oh my God," at the top of my lungs. Marcus panicked, asking what the hell was going on while I frantically dug through my bag for my cell phone. I briefly considered asking him to stop the car, but an image flashed through my mind of us lying dead in that field, covered in gunshot wounds. So I told him to keep driving while explaining that a kid had just been thrown down a well. What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus asked, because he'd been focused on the road and hadn't seen anything. Once I provided crucial details, he asked if I was absolutely certain I hadn't been mistaken, understanding why I was so freaked out. I finally found my phone, but when I unlocked its 0 bars, so I grabbed our map to locate the nearest town. Relief washed over me when I spotted one just a few miles ahead. I told Marcus to floor it so we could reach it and call 911. We arrived at a small town moments later. The first place we saw was a diner called Albert's Kitchen, right off the highway. We pulled into the parking lot and I nearly fell rushing from the car to the front doors. Once inside, everyone's heads turned as I ran to the counter and asked to use their phone. The lady behind the counter said, "Sure," and I dialed 911 as she placed the phone on the counter. While describing what happened to the dispatcher, everyone in the diner listened in, gasping when I mentioned seeing a child thrown down a well. The dispatcher instructed me to wait where I was for a deputy from the sheriff's office, then thanked me. After hanging up, I turned around to find every single person in the diner staring at me. The counter lady brought me ice water to help me calm down. As Marcus and I waited for police, a man stood from his table and approached us. He introduced himself and started asking about the burned fields we'd seen. After I described them, how every field for miles was blackened, and Charlie turned to another diner and mentioned someone named Arthur Landry. Then he asked me to describe the man I'd seen. Everyone seemed to agree it was Arthur Landry I'd witnessed, and that his grandchildren had been staying with him that week because their parents were out of town. Everyone looked shocked, but also deeply confused. They obviously knew this Landry guy well, so hearing he'd done something so horrible, they simply couldn't believe it. They asked me multiple times if I was certain. When I insisted I'd never been more sure of anything in my life, there was almost a ripple of "oh my God" and "oh dear Lord" throughout the room. I'm not sure how long passed before a deputy actually arrived to speak with us. When he did, we stepped outside to our car to talk privately away from the diner patrons. I repeated the entire story and got that same "are you sure" reaction from the deputy, as though what I'd described was verging on impossible or ridiculous. Then, right as he was questioning me, another patrol car arrived. Out stepped the county sheriff, who'd driven from headquarters to speak with us personally. The deputy explained what I'd seen to the sheriff, saving me from repeating my story for the 4th time. The sheriff also gave me that skeptical "huh, really?" reaction, then walked off to talk on his radio for several minutes before returning. He informed us that someone at headquarters had called Mr. Landry to ask about what I'd witnessed. Arthur claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. While he did have his grandson staying with him that week, they hadn't been anywhere near those burned cornfields. By then, I was practically begging the sheriff to drive us back down the highway, so I could show him the exact well I was talking about. He explained he could unjust walk onto someone's property without a warrant, and would need to speak with Mr. Landry personally before taking such action. I tried to keep my composure. I knew that the longer we talked, the less chance that child had of surviving the foreknot, to mention whatever was at the bottom of the well. If it was water, he might drown. If it was dry, we needed to extract him immediately before he died. I tried to convey all of this as effectively as possible, but the more animated I became, the more the sheriff and his deputies started looking at me like I was insane. I literally had to beg before the sheriff instructed his deputy to drive out to the old well on that farm and check it out. When he agreed, I was so genuinely thankful I nearly burst into tears. Throughout our wait, Marcus kept saying, "It's going to be okay, you'll see, everything's going to be fine." The sheriff sat halfway in his patrol car, talking on his radio. Then suddenly, he stood and walked over, calling out that he had good news. First, the well on that farm was empty. Second, Mr. Landry was heading to the diner with his grandson, so I could see for myself that everything was fine. I was speechless. I remained certain and still am about what I'd witnessed out there. The sheriff took advantage of my stunned silence to explain how thankfully I must have just been mistaken. Perhaps I'd seen them picking up the child to show him the bottom, and any dropping or falling was an optical illusion created by our high speed through the smoke. The only thing I could think to ask when words finally returned was, how could the deputy be certain the well was empty? Was he sure there wasn't a child down there underwater, or just beyond his flashlight's reach? I knew what I'd seen. A child's life was at stake, and I wasn't about to accept someone else's word for it. Especially when they kept throwing around phrases like optical illusion and trick of the light, which started sounding more suspicious the more they repeated them. I understood small-town mentality wanting to protect their own, but their lack of concern was turning from alarming to disturbing. As I tried staying calm and polite while explaining that I knew what I saw, the deputy returned from checking the well. Following behind him was a beat-up old truck, and out stepped a large man in overalls with thinning dark hair. His first words, delivered aggressively, were, "Now who's saying I threw my damn grandson down a well?" He sounded furious. The sheriff intervened. "Hey now, "Just hold on, Arthur. She's just trying to help." This man named Arthur walked round to his truck's passenger side, opened the door, and helped a young boy out. He led the child around to us, then told me in a very aggressive, accusatory tone that this was the boy he'd supposedly thrown down the well. Marcus whispered comfortingly, "See, I told you everything would be fine." But things were not fine, because the child I'd seen had blonde curly hair, and this kid had dark closely cropped hair. I started getting more frantic as I explained it wasn't the same child. The deputy tried telling me maybe it was sunlight catching his hair that made it appear blonde. Having them try to make me feel crazy made me want to scream, but I knew that would only hurt my case. Instead, I tried asking if there was anyone else I could speak with, because I didn't feel they were being helpful. While the deputy and I talked, the sheriff asked Marcus if they could speak privately. Minutes later, Marcus returned saying we needed to leave. The sheriff had basically asked if I was mentally unstable. When Marcus said no, the sheriff told him to get out of town before I was arrested for public disturbance. They couldn't have people rolling into town throwing around accusations and tarnishing a good man's reputation. Unless we had other official business, we were to leave immediately or face arrest. By that point, I actually wanted to leave. I had this horrible, creeping feeling that something dark was happening in that small town. Whatever it was, neither Marcus nor I would uncover it while standing in that diner's parking lot. I faked an apology to that farmer and his grandson, whoever the poor kid actually was. The second we were back on the road with cell reception, I called Iowa State Patrol to report everything. I told them I believed something messed up was occurring in that town, specifically on Arthur Landry's farm, but they responded saying there was nothing to it. I went through the entire complaints process, arguing that my report wasn't being handled properly. Again, they insisted they'd done everything possible, but there was still nothing to report. But I know what I saw. I'd never experienced hallucinations before or since. I don't need glasses, and no, I'm not crazy. The Peruvian mistaken identity, my father worked for the Foreign Office and met my mother while stationed in Peru. Mum's heritage meant everything to her, so Peruvian food and music were huge parts of my childhood. We only visited once when I was young, so in my late 20s, I decided to fly over to visit relatives and explore my mother country properly. I was driving down a rural back road in the middle of nowhere, trying to find the small town where my relatives lived, when suddenly I spotted flashing lights in my rearview mirror. Peruvian police were pulling me over for some reason. Not wanting to cause trouble, I pulled over quickly and prepared to use my very rusty Spanish. But instead of getting out slowly with sunglasses like American cops do in movies, this officer took a defensive stance behind his open car door and started ordering me over his loudspeaker to stick my hands out the window. Immediately, I was terrified. I'd barely seen guns in real life, let alone had one pointed at me. As I shouted that I was unarmed and frightened, he acted like I was some hardened criminal, yelling at me to shut my mouth while slowly approaching my window. He pressed his gun right against my face while trying to put handcuffs on me one-handed. One slip of his trigger finger and my brains would have decorated the passenger seat. As he struggled with this, more police cars started arriving before they literally dragged me from the car and hauled me off to jail. Being in that cell was probably the single lowest point of my entire life. Police kept throwing around words like murderer, violator, and hurting children. One even gasped and said, "That's him," as I was led through the station. I kept experiencing waking nightmares about being imprisoned in a foreign country for something I didn't do. These visions were intensified by occasional officers approaching to hurl abuse through the bars. I tried telling them I was British and only there on holiday, but they responded by asking if I thought they were stupid and threatening to shut my mouth themselves. Terrible stuff like that. This continued for hours, and I thought my life was over. Then out of nowhere, someone unlocked my cell and said there'd been a mistake. I was free to go. Walking out of that police station felt surreal. I was shaking like a leaf, but the officers were either laughing about the mix-up or offering apologies that did remotely cover what I'd endured. They acted like they'd ticketed the wrong car, not dragged me into the station at gunpoint. Regardless, I was just relieved to leave. I was angry too, but couldn't show it unless they found reason to lock me up again. Before leaving though, they showed me a picture of the man they'd confused me with, the violent, wanted criminal, a truly dangerous individual. Looking at his picture was like staring into a mirror. When I asked my relatives if I was entitled to compensation, they laughed and said, "No chance. I had an amazing time overall and don't regret going, but I haven't returned to Peru since. Next time, I'm having family pick me up from the bloody airport." The Windsor grocery store massacre, the worst day of my life, fell on a Sunday in a small town called Windsor on the Carolina coast. Back then, Windsor housed fewer than 2,000 people and was your typical backwoods North Carolina community. We had a grocery store, gas station, Bojangles, and the peanut factory. Aside from a few churches and chapels surrounding town, that was essentially it. Windsor was quiet and neighborly. Murder wasn't a word you heard spoken locally only on radio or television. But then came that night in 1993 when all that televised evil stepped off the screen and walked through our town. It was the evening of June 6th. I was at the Bertie County Sheriff's Office, about a mile south of town. The county jail was located there too. After collecting paperwork from one of the deputies, I sat at my desk quietly filling it out, when we suddenly heard dispatch crackle over our radios. It was the quietest day of the week, so nobody expected anything more serious than a civil dispute or minor accident. When we heard the codes for man with a gun and multiple deaths, there was a split second where I was convinced there'd been some mistake. But when I saw my fellow deputies sprinting from the office toward their vehicles, I knew it was real. I followed them into the parking lot, jumped into my cruiser, and we sped off in a rough convoy toward the grocery store on town's north side. This store was called Biloa, play on below, as in the prices here below. It rivaled local churches as a place where folks could congregate and converse. Knowing the three deceased were most likely people I knew, maybe even friends, that was already a tough pill to swallow during that frantic rush. When we arrived, the place was closed and locked up since they shut early on Sundays. We still had virtually no idea what to expect. The 911 call that reached dispatch had come from a wounded survivor of whatever had occurred. Being in so much pain, they couldn't provide much detail. We only knew there were bodies, a man with a gun, and survivors desperately needing help. Bilo had glass panel windows running along the entire front. On approach, you could see a long trail of blood extending from front to back of the store. After we burst inside, we discovered all that blood belonged to a member of Bilo's cleaning crew who decrawled from the back with gunshot wounds to use the phone. The other deputies and I spread out once inside, clearing the store aisle by aisle to ensure nobody was waiting to ambush us. When we reached the back, we found 5 more people. 3 were dead, another badly wounded with stab wounds. For some reason, the killer had left the 5th person and the cleaning crew member completely unharmed. There was no helping most of those who'd been shot. But we did what we could for the survivors, and thankfully both made it through. While Ems worked on airlifting the wounded to the hospital, we heard the complete story from that one crew member who walked away covered in blood but without a scratch. It was every bit as bad as we'd feared. Every Sunday, a cleaning crew stopped by Bilo to wax the floors and prepare them for the coming week. So at 6 p.m. closing time, once customers had left, the store manager let the crew inside and locked the doors behind them. The crew started moving mats and readying their buffer machines when the last remaining store clerk spotted someone she didn't recognize step from one of the aisles. She assumed it was a customer who'd failed to notice the store closing. But when she approached to inform him it was after hours, he pointed a gun at her face. The cleaning crew at the store's front had no idea what was happening. The gunman moved so quietly on the clerk that they remained completely unaware. As he forced her into the back office, they continued working normally. Once in the office, the gunman ordered the manager to hand over all on-site cash. He'd struck at the perfect time right at week's end. We know he escaped with several $1,000s in cash, plus about $3,000 in money orders. But instead of simply leaving after getting the money, the gunman ordered the manager and clerk back onto the shop floor, then rounded up the cleaning crew too. I didn't see exactly what bound the victims, but I later heard it was dog leashes the gunman grabbed from one of the aisles. Once he had all 6 people at the back of the store, he ordered them to tie each other up at gunpoint. He tied the final person himself. Our survivor said once everyone was bound, he thought the ordeal was over. The guy had his money. He had everyone restrained so they couldn't immediately call police. He had absolutely no reason to do what he did next, but he did it anyway. The gunman started stacking people in pairs, ordering them to lie atop one another. Before anyone could understand why, he said, "God forgive me for what I'm about to do," then started shooting into the stacks. He only fired a couple shots before either his gun jammed or he ran out of ammunition. When he ran off, our survivor thought it was finally over for a second time. But seconds later, the gunman came running back with a knife he'd grabbed from somewhere, and he started asking the survivor if they were going to tell police about him. Obviously, the survivor said no. So did the man stacked on top of him, who, we later discovered, was the survivor's own brother. But as they tried convincing the guy they wouldn't identify him, he flipped out and started stabbing the brother on top. He slashed the guy's throat from ear to ear, then kept stabbing his back until the knife blade broke off inside him. Our survivor claims the killer then asked him a second time if he'd identify him to police. When he said no again, the gunman walked out with the money, leaving the last man alive. Our survivor said he was convinced the guy would return just like before when he de-grabbed the knife. He also had his dead brother on top of him, so he probably couldn't have moved even if he'd wanted to. The surviving cleaning crew member, thinking the other man was dead, managed to free himself from the dog leash before crawling toward the store's front, which is where we found him with the phone still in his hand. Regarding the investigation that followed, I don't remember ever being so personally invested in a case. One victim was a relative of the county sheriff, so he made bringing in the perpetrator his personal mission. But from the start, things went wrong. First, Bilo's security camera system wasn't operational during the attack. They had a repairman scheduled for that coming week. While the timing still haunts me, it obviously meant we had no security footage of our suspect. Second, all 3 survivors gave us matching descriptions, very distinct ones, too. He supposedly had a crooked nose and hazel eyes, but the sketches we circulated didn't generate any solid sightings. All we had were reports of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding out of town on Route 17, not immediately after the murders, but close enough. When that car was tracked down, its owner was cleared of involvement. Wrong place, wrong time. The most frustrating part was how the investigation fixated on one detail I am not even sure was accurate. At one point, a victim asked the killer, "Why are you doing this?" While she was referring to them being stacked atop one another, the guy must have interpreted it as a more general, "Why are you robbing us?" question, he said. Something about being a former cop recently fired from his job, though it was clear early on he couldn't have been a cop's. Since there was no match on his fingerprints, the lead investigators seemed convinced he was either former military or former law enforcement. That completely contradicted what people like myself came to believe, that he was a fugitive who killed to eliminate witnesses. By the time the investigation seriously considered that possibility, the killer could have easily fled the country using the thousands he'd stolen. That's my best guess why he wasn't caught. Afterward, people in law enforcement talked about what happened like it was a tornado or something, this terrible, almost random event nobody could have prevented. But I still felt useless. The worst thing to happen in Windsor for maybe 200 years occurred while I sat on my ass writing paperwork as some sick bastard stacked bodies and executed them 2 at a time. But what I still can't figure out is, why did he let the last victim live? Our survivor told us, the killer explicitly stated, "I'm going to let you live." That makes my fugitive theory seem shaky. Part of me thinks he just got tired of killing and could unface stabbing a second person to death after murdering what he believed were 4 others. But there's another part of me, one that thinks he left one alive so he could tell everyone what happened. Because he wanted everyone to know what he did and how he did it, so he could maybe read about it in the papers afterward. I try not to entertain that side of me, because when I do, it makes the pain of not catching that guy hurt even worse. The Nickel Mines schoolhouse shooting. I grew up in Bart Township, rural Pennsylvania, specifically around Nickel Mines, home to many old order Amish. If you're rethinking of Amish who practice Rumspringa or use flip phones because they re-essential technology, this isn't them. These people are so traditional they still refer to anyone who isn't Amish as English. That was my childhood, living like we were aliens in our own country. But I didn't know any better, so I was happy right up until October 2nd, 2006. Like most kids my age, I'd dropped out after 8th grade to help my father on the farm. That morning, we were working together while my younger brother Samuel was at school. Everything proceeded normally, just another day on the farm when, suddenly Dad said, "Is that your brother?" I looked up to see a small figure sprinting down the tracks toward our farmhouse. I recognized him immediately. Dad asked, "What the hell's he doing out of school?" Since it was only 11 a.m., I followed him as he marched toward the house to find out what was happening. We arrived to find Samuel in tears with Mum comforting him. Dad still assumed he'd simply run away from school, so he was getting angry. But when Samuel finally got his words out and told us why he'd fled school, it felt like time stood still for several seconds. He told us there was a man in the classroom, and he had a gun. If you can believe it, this wasn't even the scariest part. As Dad freaked out and rushed to grab his own gun, Samuel said something about the man having chains and hooks too. That was it. Red mist descended over Dad, and he ran off toward the old schoolhouse while ordering me to stay put and protect Mom and Samuel. We had to wait hours before Dad returned with news. When he did, this is what he told us. Around 10:30 that morning, shortly after kids returned from recess, a pickup truck parked in front of the schoolhouse. A man got out, walked inside, and asked the teacher if she'd found a clevis pin in the road. A clevis pin is like a bolt used to fasten things together, commonly used in farming, so almost everyone around Nickel Mines knew what one was. Since the teacher hadn't spotted one that morning, she apologized for not being able to help, but wished him luck finding his missing pin. The guy acted strange. He didn't make eye contact and mumbled some reply before walking back to his truck. But a minute later, he returned with a pistol. He told everyone they either do as he says or they're going to die. Thinking it was just a robbery, the teacher instructed the class to comply. But instead of stealing the petty cash box and leaving, the guy ordered all the young boys, if this story moved you, hit subscribe with notifications on, and tell me in the comments what city are you watching from.